We talked about primitive housing, we talked about concrete supplements and abrasives, but the use of volcanic materials in agriculture and gardening is something that is taking off increasingly over the last few hundred years. And well, volcanic areas are known for making very good wine. And why is that? Well, here's a few examples: Etna and Cuvée de Volcan, which is from the Auvergne, and then of course a wine from the Canaries, La Caldera. And well, the issue is that volcanic material is very fertile, and you need three ingredients. You need volcanic material, you need water, and you need heat. And of course in Indonesia, once more here, Merapi volcano, you have all of those three coming together. It's tropical climate, it's very wet, it's very warm, and you have a lot of volcanoes, and this is what feeds the soil in the lowlands. And there you have all these rice paddies feeding a large and ever-growing population in that country. And it rains there almost every day, so the picture on the left is really taken half an hour apart from the picture on the right, and there you see that the rain is coming down. It's very wet and therefore also extremely lush. This is the reason why in Indonesia we're growing a lot of spices. Well, the Dutch called it the Spice Islands, and we have all sorts of vegetables growing there. And for example, chili peppers grow particularly well on volcanoes, and therefore some brands use this, like the one here, Krakatoa pepper, supposedly being extra spicy, I guess. There is something very important, and I brought my coffee here. Believe it or not, over 70% of all coffee is grown on volcanic soil. If you drink coffee in the morning, there is an extremely high chance you're touching volcano in some form. And here's a map of coffee consumption. And Scandinavia, the darker the color on the map, the more coffee is drunk. And Scandinavia has the highest coffee consumption in the world. And I think it connects to the lack of sun. When the sun is, well, absent, then you want to get some energy from somewhere. So people drink coffee. And as you see in Iceland, where the sun doesn't shine very much either, coffee is extremely popular. It's less popular in other parts of the world. Here's a few impressions. This is a coffee plantation in Java, and here they actually have the coffee plants lower down, and they have taller trees to give shade to the coffee plants. And yeah, here it states it again, 70% of all coffee is grown on volcanic soil. And here's a few coffee beans. And here, a few impressions. This is how the coffee beans look like, and then you have to roast the beans, dry them first, roast them, and eventually you get these dark beans that you grind up, and you make coffee from that. Another important crop that is grown on volcanic soil is actually chocolate, believe it or not. And this is some cocoa beans that have been harvested at Merapi volcano. There's a whole plantation, and there you can buy volcano chocolate. And well, it was nice enough, I thought. Of course, here we have a combination of things. This is products from Hawaii, and there you get macadamia nuts grown on the lush soils of Hawaii. And you can actually have that together with Kona coffee on the right-hand side. So you get the nuts and the coffee glazing and all of this together. So all of these features, all of these things are grown on volcanic soil, very lush, very fertile volcanic soil. And if you go to, for example, the Dole plantation on Hawaii, they even say that here on their display board, that their pineapples wouldn't grow that well without the volcanic soil. It's the secret ingredient. Actually, I think I have it here. Yes, so this is from their display board. Pineapples are grown in rich volcanic soil and warm tropical rainfall, kissed with Hawaiian sunshine. So that's the magic 3 ingredients. And of course, when you're there, you must enjoy this. Tea. Tea is also grown on volcanic soil, less so than coffee, but tea is often grown in high altitudes, and often that is also volcanoes. So a lot of tea also comes from volcanoes. I estimate about 40% of tea that we drink is grown on volcanic soil. And I'd like to show you yet another cash crop. This is this one here. Anyone any idea what this plant is? tobacco. Tobacco is, of course, these days falling out of favor, but there's renewed uses for this. It's actually, the nicotine is actually a pesticide. The plants have developed it in order to fight off insects, and we can use that as well. So these days, we're actually growing a lot of tobacco, not for smoking purposes, but actually to use it as a chemical pesticide, as a natural pesticide. So this is the tobacco plant when it's more mature, and then it looks a bit more like the thing we harvest. And eventually we do, of course, harvest this, we dry it, and then it's rolled up to make cigars. And I stopped smoking many years ago, but every now and then I get tempted and I enjoy a little cigar. When I was in Hawaii, they actually offer all these different Volcano cigar flavors. And there is well, coconut, vanilla, and chocolate flavors. I decided to go for coconut. It was okay. And here I recommend that you try that as well. So this was the one I've chosen in the end. And talking about volcanoes and gardening or agriculture, we have to talk about Lanzarote. We're actually on the way to Lanzarote, so this is quite fascinating. And Lanzarote was instrumental here. There was a very large and long eruption, 1730 to 36, and it lasted for 2,056 days. And 23% of the entire island were covered with lava and ash. So here's a little map. The colors on the map, they give the different lava flows during different episodes of the 6-year eruption. But you get the idea. In the little inset in the top right, you see the red area. So about a quarter of the island was suddenly rendered useless for agriculture. Well, the king in Spain got very concerned because the island was struggling anyway. It couldn't sustain a large population. There was a lot of pirate problems from North Africa. And now a volcanic eruptions. He was even thinking about giving up the island altogether. But, well, before you make drastic decisions, he sent his best person, and he sent a bishop, Davia. Bishop Davia was going to inspect the situation. And he noted very, very quickly that thin ash cover on the fields is good for the crops. Thick cover is not good. So, of course, he ordered that all farmers that come back use a thin layer of volcanic ash. And indeed, it did fertilize the soils and changed the entire way agriculture was done in the Canary Islands ever since. And from there, this idea was exported into other parts of the Spanish Empire, and nowadays we are supplementing soil literally everywhere. If you have pot plants at home and you have these little round particles, this is effectively an artificial volcanic particle. We are doing this now in a factory, but the concept is that we have a porous little particle that allows to keep moisture inside, and it's good for the plants. They have more access to moisture and also nutrients that come from these rocks. And here, these desert-like islands, they're actually nowadays, well, reasonably fertile, and you can grow wine and other crops there. The area of La Guerra, as it's known, it hosts vast stretches of these fields. The wind can be very strong. This is why they built these little walls. But these are wines that are growing there. And the wine there is increasingly famous again. And I'm saying again because it used to be famous back in the old days. So here, in the old days, I mean back in the days of the Vienna Congress, after Napoleon was defeated, the menu of the Vienna Congress actually states that the famous Malvasia wine from Lanzarote was one of the highlights there. So here's a few more impressions, but I wondered a few years ago, what is actually the real secret? Because it makes sense that volcanic particles with little bubbles or vesicles, they can hold water for longer, they can hold the moisture for longer. But is that all? So I went and took some samples, and I put them under the electron microscope, the scanning electron microscope, which allows you to look into something with incredible magnification. I was a bit surprised, I have to admit, what we found. There's life in these rocks. So there is a whole suite of microorganisms. And in the top left here, you see a vesicle. And inside the vesicle, there's a lot of organic debris. And in some of the other images, you see these creatures. I have no idea what they are called, so I had to ask a specialist, and he identified them all for me. So I give the Latin names here on the bottom. And this is very, very small. We're talking about microns. And these little beasts, they live in there. They break down the rock. And what they also do is they capture a lot of carbon. These organisms, they grow, they die, and then new generations grow. A lot of carbon can be fixed inside this soil. We call it living soil, and that's good in this context. And of course, it also breaks down the rock. These little beasts break down the rock, and that means they release nutrients into the soil that plants can take up. So, two important things here. There's a gradual supply of nutrients like phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and iron. That is good for the plants, but the microorganisms also lock a lot of CO2, and they create what's known as living soil. And this led some researchers to propose that if we were to put a lot of volcanic particles on a lot of fields all over the world, we could actually have a tremendous impact for climate. And indeed, some people made some calculations. This is merely calculations, but when you think about sequestering CO2, getting it out of the atmosphere, then this is a very good idea and probably quite cheap. You could potentially sequester up to about 20% of the CO2 that we need to reduce in the atmosphere according to the Paris Agreement. And I'm giving you this diagram from Beerling's paper. And here we have, with the red box, Spain. And this is a projection. Spain could actually reduce its carbon output by about 10-15% simply by putting more volcanic particles on their soil. And this is done for all the countries, all the major countries in the world. For some countries, it has more effect than for others. But this could be a very cheap way of increasing quality of soil while at the same time reducing CO2 in the atmosphere. Something to think about. So, there's other great ideas that people have developed with volcanoes. And, well, sometimes I get this question, would it be possible to avert global warming by triggering volcanoes? Because volcanoes are known to cool the planet. There is the concept of volcanic winters. The problem with that is that, yes, they do cool, but only for 2-3 years, and then they also have a lot of CO2. So the CO2 stays in the atmosphere for much longer. The sulfur that causes the cooling stays less long, and the problem will be that once the effect of the sulfur has worn off, the CO2 stays. Problem, therefore, would be you have to trigger a new volcano every 2 or 3 years. It becomes a runaway effect, and therefore I think it's a little too experimental, and I would advise people to think very carefully before they do things like that. So, let's move on towards the really nice sides of things. Geotourism, a few words about that. And in a way, that's what we are doing. We have been looking at volcanoes and volcanic landscapes for a long time. And here we're using it not only for enjoyment. Initially, people were using it, Europeans were using volcanoes in the Canaries as landmarks for navigation. And here, for example, is a map of Iceland. And let me just see whether I can get there. Oops, here we are. So here you see Hekla volcano with a big eruption cloud on top, big fires coming out, and this was supposed to be the entrance to hell, back in the old days at least. So I'll just continue, although Nick is talking there. And here's a few more impressions, the geology of the Canary Islands with geological excursions. And in the top right, we have my nephew at one of the volcanic visitor centers on La Palma in that case. And then, of course, on the left-hand side, we have Hawaii. And Hawaii is a tourist magnet because of the national park and the volcanic activity. So it goes even that far that some people claim that volcanoes have saved Iceland's economy during the recent COVID crisis because, well, Iceland lives off two things, fishery and tourism, and during COVID, tourism basically stopped until the volcano erupted. Literally thousands and tens of thousands of people went there to see the volcano, and the Icelanders were quite open. They allowed everybody to go there and have a barbecue at the volcano if you wanted to. And there was a few weird things, a few accidents happened. One person died, one hiker died at some point in an accident, but actually the volcano itself killed nobody. And this was literally a tourist eruption. And so many people came to see it that some people claim it was a blessing for Iceland's economy at the time. This is, of course, a feature we see all around the world. This goes on with national parks already in the 50s and 60s, but then you can choose your flavor. You can go to the Kilauea military camp or have the Jeep safari or any of those features. All of them are building on the volcanic phenomenon. So here's a few impressions. You can even do volcano surfing these days. You can surf down volcano slopes in Nicaragua, if you so choose, and of course jeep safaris and boat tours, etc. This is not always good because sometimes people go to the wrong place, like White Island in New Zealand. The image in the lower right is from there, and there was a very nasty accident a little while back, and several people died actually, and there was a big court case, and the tour operator was held responsible for bringing people to an unsafe place. Unsafe or not, this can be used, and I'd like to point out that this gentleman there, Spartacus, well, that's not Spartacus himself, that's Kirk Douglas, obviously, but he was playing Spartacus. He was smart enough to use this because he had to hide from the Roman army, he had to get away from them, so he had to go somewhere where the Romans wouldn't want to go. So he was actually camping just below Vesuvius, and the Roman armies decided that's not a good place to go. We don't want to go there. So he camped where this little red star is, in between the old Soma wall and the new Vesuvius volcano, and he was actually left in peace for several years there, and he was regrouping and using this as a base camp. And indeed, Vesuvius is, of course, a milestone. Vesuvius was one of those volcanoes that is emblematic, and some of the first photography in Europe comes from there. And here is Pompeii. This is an artist's impression on the right, how Pompeii could have looked like during the 79 AD eruption. And this is Pompeii today. So there we have a lot of information about Roman life that the volcano preserved. In the bottom there we have a kitchen. I call it a Roman McDonald's. You could just walk in and get a meal. And all of this is something we only understand because Pompeii got buried by the volcanic ash. So a few words about volcanoes and culture. And we all know Pele, the goddess of volcanoes in Hawaii. For some strange reason, she likes gin, I'm told. So whenever she's active, you have to give an offering of gin, and it calms her down. I'm not sure this works equally well here at at White Island in New Zealand. This is the site of this large disaster. And, well, the local people knew, the Maori knew that there was something not right with this place because they believed that the sea devil lived in there. So these ancient legends have, of course, some point to this. And the idea is that you don't want to go where the sea devil lives, but tourists did go there, and it led to this disaster. I should also point out that in Roman and Greek culture, we had Vulcan, that's, well, where the name comes from, volcanoes. In Greek, Hephaestos, and he's the god of fire and volcanoes. And, amazingly, the Romans understood this. He's also the god of metalworks. So they understood that there's a link between metals and volcanoes. So I want to close with a few words about the Edda. The Edda is the book of the Vikings, and it was written about 1000 AD. And it is often asked, is there any kind of reference the Vikings made to volcanoes? And It's not a direct reference, but there was a big eruption, the Elkjau eruption, and it erupted in about 934 AD, and it actually stopped the influx of settlers from Norway. It was that nasty an eruption. The Elkjau lavas reached the coast, and 3 very harsh winters followed. There was a climate effect of the eruption. And there are several descriptions in the Edda. Here, for example, it says, there will be a winter with the greatest frost and keen winds, and the sun will do no good. There will be 3 of these. This was used in the Edda to describe the end of the world, Ragnarök. And, well, I believe that this description of the end of the world was actually inspired by the Elkjau eruption, because people did witness the eruption. It goes on there in the Edda, it says, the sun will turn black, and the land will sink into the sea. The brightest stars will vanish from the skies, and fire will rage forth, and the flames will lick heavens itself. And the next part is particularly cool. Boulders will slam together so big that trolls will tumble, and man will tread the path to hell. So this is a very intense volcanic eruption, and this is what I think gave rise to these descriptions. And we have an independent source. It's very important to have independent sources. Here it says in the Saxon Chronicles from northern Germany, in the years before the death of King Heinrich, and he was the first Saxon king, so it was important for the Saxons to report that he was a special person, and he died in 936, so we have good time keeping here. The source says many signs occurred. The mountains of the north are said to have erupted flames in many places, and the brightness of the sun itself seemed to diminish. So here, volcanoes have even given rise to legends and sagas all over the world. I'd like to close here because there's an event on deck and you shouldn't miss it. And I say thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Professor Val, thank you very much. And yes, as he says,